welcome everybody. Since it's primarily just the Terra team to start, we'll be a little bit casual, but first and foremost want to welcome Gary Brode, Deep Knowledge Investing. Gary, would you mind giving a quick background on you and Deep Knowledge Investing to kick it off?
Sure, thanks, Tony. We provide actionable investment ideas and timely market commentary to hedge funds, family offices, portfolio managers, and sophisticated investors. Recently, we've had some fantastic calls with some great research behind it on Las Vegas Sands, on HCA. Most notably, earlier this year, in late February and early March, we put out a series of 4 pieces right ahead of the coronavirus issues in the United States, recommending that people short the market. That turned out to be the call of the year. And we're basically available to help anybody who's a sophisticated portfolio manager who wants to get better returns in the public equity part of their portfolio. That's what we do.
That's great, Gary, thanks so much. And again, so this is the new Terra Stories Impact Investment Series, the launch of it. Gary, today I'll be interviewing Gary. We'll be discussing cruise line pollution specifically, but moving forward, Gary will be the host alongside, well, separately with Paul Savoldelli. So we'll be talking about public companies and sectors, as well as private companies that have some form of impact on the planet while making money. So with that, Gary, again, cruise line pollution, I'm just going to ask a series of questions, and I think everyone has the ability to also send questions via chat. Is that accurate, Gary?
Yeah, if anyone has questions or things they want to talk about, feel free to put it through the chat function. I will give you 1 or 2 responses. I'll either give you the best answer I have, or just say, great question, we'll come back to you with more detail.
And again, we are recording this. After we're finished, we're going to edit it and we're going to put it on all of our websites, both the Terra websites and social media channels, as well as Gary's Deep Knowledge Investing website and social media channels. Okay, so Gary, why are we looking at an old industry like the cruise lines in relation to improving the environment?
Thanks, Tony. It's a great question, and the reason it's important is because when people talk about improving the environment, they often think about new industries, new technology, new forms of energy production. That's the exciting part of it. You know, what's the next new thing we're going to do to make the environment better? And we think those efforts are fantastic and that they're going to help shape a cleaner world in the future. But right now, there's a lot of leverage in making improvements in older high pollution industries. There's a lot that can be done before we have those new technologies to just make the environment better, cleaner, with very little cost or inconvenience to customers.
Interesting. Don't you think that the cruise line industry has a bad history when it comes to the environment?
They do. It's been a problem for a long time. Besides the fact that the ships themselves are huge polluters, they use these old diesel engines. There have been issues with dumping. Carnival, we'll talk about this later, but Carnival has recently had all kinds of legal and regulatory issues. Royal Caribbean got caught dumping somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-some years ago. So historically, this has not been a great industry for the environment, but over the last half decade or so, there's been a huge change in both regulation and the way the ships are powered and managed, and things are getting a lot better very quickly.
And what do you think the current situation is with cruise lines now?
Well, so with COVID, the current pollution situation is right around zero. There are very few ships sailing. I think Genting has a couple of, they're calling them cruises to nowhere, sailing out of Asia, where they just get on the water, sail out, sail back. People like being on the boats. But the vast majority of the cruise ship fleet in the world is docked at the moment. So right now, if you like cruising, this is worst case scenario. If you want to eliminate pollution, it's best case scenario. The only thing I can tell you is that the current situation will not last forever. At some point, these boats will be back in the water and people will be sailing again.
And are the new ships better than the old ones when it comes to emissions?
It's been a night and day change. One place where there's been easy, very fast improvement is a new engine and ship technology. The new ships they're building are much larger and much more fuel efficient. So in general, the new ships are about 30% more fuel efficient than the ships that are a decade or two older. And in terms of reducing emissions, just think about what happened in the United States with the auto business when we went from cars that got maybe 15 miles to the gallon to now it's very common for cars to get 30 miles to the gallon. We're using a lot less fuel. The new ships are, because they're larger, have better engines, are more fuel efficient. They're using in general 30% less fuel. The other thing is there are all kinds of technological improvements. There's improved hull design. And the reason that matters is it reduces drag in the water. And so when you do something like that, you actually get free fuel economy, right? If the ship is being slowed down less by being pulled through the water, you'll get better fuel mileage. The other thing is the cruise lines are turning over their fleet. And I came to deep knowledge investing from Silver Arrow. At Silver Arrow, we had a multi-year thesis on the cruise lines, but a big part of it related to the better return on invested capital that you get from the newer, larger ships. And so what the cruise lines are doing is every year they're adding these newer, more efficient ships, and they're selling some of the older, smaller, less efficient ships. These fleets are modernizing over time, and that has a beneficial effect on fuel usage, the environment, and on emissions.
Great, thank you. What incentives do the companies have to do something about this?
Well, so besides the fact that there are some new regulations that they need to comply with, and we'll get to that in a little bit, a lot of what's happening is actually beneficial to the cruise lines themselves. So realize that fuel is a gigantic expense for these companies. And over the last 5 years, just as an example, Royal Caribbean and Norwegian have cut fuel costs as a percentage of revenue almost in half. They've gone from somewhere in the neighborhood of 11, 12% of revenue to 6, 7% of revenue. And so this is a situation where what's good for the company shareholders is also good for the environment. It's not a bad trade-off. It's the kind of thing where literally everyone is benefiting.
So we've heard about new emissions regulations that went into effect this year. Can you tell us something about that?
Sure. So the International Maritime Organization, referred to as IMO, the new regulations were IMO 2020. And it's just a fancy way of talking about the new regulations they had to limit sulfur emissions starting in January of this year. But it was a huge decrease. The limit was lowered from 3.5% M/M, which is mass to mass, to 0.5%. So what we're talking about is a reduction in allowable emissions by 86%. It's just an enormous change in terms of emissions. So the thing that worked with this was they announced it way in advance. The large cruise lines, again, that would be Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, and Carnival, started to work on this back in 2014. So they've basically had 5 or 6 years to prepare themselves to meet this huge change in regulations. And we're actually happy to report that they were able to do it. Now, we haven't seen the benefits of that this year, again, because pretty much the whole fleet has been docked all year because of COVID. But when these ships start to sail again, hopefully in 2021, we'll see the benefits of that. And they have prepared themselves to reduce their emissions by 6/7.
Wow, amazing. And so how are they meeting the new emissions regulations specifically?
So to understand that, it's important to go back a bit and understand how the ships have been fueled. And historically, cruise ships used bunker fuel. It's a high sulfur fuel, almost like a sludge. It's very inexpensive, very low quality, and very high emission. It's kind of what's left after you take off the high quality stuff that you put in a race car or a jet engine. To give you a sense, Royal Caribbean was using low sulfur fuel for around 30% of its usage before 2020. So the other side of that is they were using 70% bunker fuel. And the low sulfur fuel is considerably more expensive, typically by about 70%. Again, that depends on the price of fuel, and the relative prices in between bunker fuel and low sulfur fuel can change. But just to give you a sense, it's about 70% more expensive. So once these new regulations go into effect, which they did in January of this year, Royal Caribbean will still be using about 30% low sulfur fuel. So how is it better, right? If you were at 30% low sulfur, 70% bunker, and you're still at that, what's improved? And the difference here is being made up by installing what are called advanced emissions purification systems. If any of you look at a press release from the company or a 10K and you see an AEP system, that's what it stands for. And that's just the fancy way of saying scrubbers. And the reason here that the low sulfur fuel usage will remain around 30% is because the scrubbers can only be installed on the larger ships. Each of the cruise lines still has some legacy ships, some of the smaller ones, and they just don't have the room to put scrubbers on some of the smaller ships. So on those ships, they'll use the less expensive, the more expensive lower sulfur fuel. To give you a better sense of what's going on at Royal Caribbean, I think it was the Miami Herald that reported that RCL planned to use scrubbers on 54% of its ships. But since those are the larger ships, that represents a much larger percentage of capacity. And again, they started installing those scrubbers in 2014 and completed the work 5 years later in 2019. So they were ready to go and meet the IMO 2020 regulations at the beginning of this year.
What about Norwegian?
They took a slightly different approach. Norwegian had planned to have scrubbers on 50% of their ships, representing 65% of their capacity by the end of last year, 2019. And the reason that those numbers are different is because you can get the scrubbers on the bigger ships. So if it's half your ships, it will end up being more than half your capacity because it'll be the larger ships. Because they had planned on adding some larger new ships with scrubbers, they expected to be at 75% capacity for scrubber usage by the end of 2021. Norwegian also planned on increasing the usage of low sulfur fuel from 30% to the 50-60% range. And we expect that the reason those numbers don't completely add up is the smaller, older ships are less fuel efficient. So as they have them in service, they're going to be using more fuel per passenger. That's our guess on that. It's not completely clear.
Thank you. And Carnival, how have they approached it?
So worth pointing out that Carnival Cruise Lines is actually bigger than Royal and Norwegian combined. Carnival owns over 100 ships. That's changing quickly for reasons we'll get into. So because Royal and Norwegian are smaller, they've been able to modernize their fleets much more quickly. Carnival at a larger size, they have a larger number of older ships, and so it's harder for them to turn over their fleet. Over 80% of Carnival's fleets will be using scrubbers starting in 2020. Again, everything's docked right now, but that's sort of where they were. But there's another side to Carnival, because in this area, there's a place where they've been more innovative than anybody else. Carnival's been a technology leader in that they're the first major cruise line to produce ships that are powered by liquefied natural gas. That could be a big trend in the future. It's considered to be environmentally more friendly, certainly, than the high sulfur bunker fuel previously used. At a minimum, it'll be great to see what Carnival's results are with the liquefied natural gas ships. Our feeling is you should try 10 different ideas, 20 different ideas, see what works, and then build more of what works. And so we give Carnival credit for being a leader in that area. It's also worth pointing out, I just gave you, Tony, a lot of statistics on the fleets and saying, this percentage of the ships will have scrubbers, this percentage will be using low sulfur fuel, this percentage of capacity. Realize that because right now, most of the world's cruise ships are docked, and the large cruise lines, every one of them, are considering or actively selling older ships. The makeup of each line's fleet is going to change significantly this year and probably next year as well. So all of these issues or percentages are going to shift heavily over the next 12 to 24 months.
So in that regard, what technologies do you think are going to be tried over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think one that we should be talking about is battery technology. Now, it is going to be a long time, maybe never, before cruise ships could be powered by battery technology. The amount of space and weight that a battery that would be required to power a cruise ship is enormous. That said, Royal Caribbean is experimenting with fuel cell systems. So just like Carnival has been a leader in using liquefied natural gas, Royal Caribbean's been a leader in experimenting with fuel cell systems. These aren't ready yet, but the industry is looking toward a lower emission, more efficient future. Another place where Carnival has been a leader is using battery power while in port. And that might not sound like a big deal, but in a lot of ways it is. And the reason for that is, so think about a typical cruise. Maybe a typical cruise is 7 days, and you have a couple of days at sea where you're using a lot of fuel to sail from place to place, and you have maybe 3 or 4 days where most of the day is spent in port. Right now, the way it works is the diesel engines from the ship would have to be on in order to power the ship's systems, the lighting, the air conditioning, the kitchens, the pumps for the swimming pool, all of basically everything you need for a cruise ship. And that produces a lot of pollution, and it's producing the pollution right next to a large civilian population. By being able to switch to battery power while in port, you can have a system where not only do you reduce the overall emissions, but you start to eliminate the emissions where people are breathing it. Now, is polluting at sea a great idea? No, but again, incremental changes, particularly incremental changes close to a civilian population, is a great way to improve things. And what we're looking for and enjoying in the cruise industry is incremental improvement. It's not going to be perfect overnight, but it is getting a lot better very quickly.
Thank you. And so beyond better technology, what are some of the easy things that cruise lines can do to reduce pollution?
Sure. So what we've been talking about so far in this discussion is new technology, new engines, hull design, scrubbers, ship design, battery, fuel cell, all that's great. The new technology is fantastic. Sometimes the low-hanging fruit is just don't do stupid things. Unfortunately, the cruise lines have a bad history of dumping polluted water or waste at sea. Now, do they all do this? No. Do they do it regularly? No. But every time they do, it ends up being a huge problem. And the reason they do it is because dumping polluted water at sea, it's easier, it's cheaper. It's also illegal and wrong and a bad idea. In 2017, Princess Cruises, which is owned by Carnival Cruise Lines, was fined $40 million for illegally dumping oily water into the ocean. That's not an insignificant fine. But last year, Carnival got caught violating probation regarding dumping. They were doing it again. And the judge in this situation was so outraged, he actually insisted that the CEO of Carnival Cruise Lines appear in person in his courtroom. And that was something to see. You know, typically if you're the CEO of a gigantic company, you send your legal team. And because they'd done this before, because they'd violated probation, the judge said, no, we are not going to let this go. And the CEO needs to appear in my courtroom. You need to demonstrate that you're taking this seriously. And I want you personally on the hook. And the judge got his way on that. So we would emphasize, it's very clear that the old dumping practices are no longer going to be tolerated like they were decades ago. Now, can I promise everybody listening to this that it'll never happen again? Of course not. But I think the penalties for engaging in this bad behavior are going to be worse. I think the patience for it is much shorter. I think the public is speaking up in a way that makes sense. The cruise ship shouldn't be dumping. And I think a lot of that behavior is starting to disappear. And the thing that I'd emphasize is that none of this requires expensive new technology. You don't have to retrofit old ships. It's low-hanging fruit that the cruise lines can and are fixing with better behavior. So, you know, hopefully it'll continue to improve.
Now, that's really interesting. So is it just the corporations, or can individual behavior matter as well?
Individual behavior matters as well. I will tell you, Tony, it's been quite a few years since I've been on a cruise ship. But one of the things that is both funny and horrifying as you walk through the ship is the number of signs they have outlining specific behavior. I remember the ship I was on, there actually was a sign that said that you couldn't defecate in the public swimming pool. Obviously, there are a reason that people put up these signs. There must have been an incident, but there were signs in every bathroom and every toilet cautioning passengers against flushing bath towels, drinking glasses, toothbrushes. The only thing I can tell you is the only reason you would put up a sign saying, please don't flush a bath towel, is because somebody tried to do it. For the life of me, I can't imagine why somebody would do something like that, but clearly it happens. You know, for anyone who's a potential passenger on a cruise ship, please realize that when you do this, you stress the ship's waste systems in ways that they aren't designed to be done. So just like it's low-hanging fruit for the cruise lines to not dump at sea, it's probably a good idea for people not to do stupid things with the ship's waste systems.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So I think there are a whole bunch of questions. Gary, I have one last quick question for you, for everyone. Do you have any buy or sell ideas that you'd like to point out to anyone? And again, I encourage everyone to go to Gary's deepknowledgeinvesting.com website, and if you're interested in his research and so forth, to reach out directly.
Sure. Thanks, Tony. So the couple of names which we've published on recently, I mentioned earlier in the call. Las Vegas Sands is very interesting. The gaming markets are really going from closed to open to much more open. Las Vegas Sands just announced that they were EBITDA profitable in Singapore in the third quarter. On the conference call, they talked about Macau being EBITDA profitable in the month of October. So that's just changed. And Las Vegas is actually pretty close to flat. So we like that. We still like HCA, the hospital company. There are fears that with so much focus on COVID, that they won't be able to do the high margin elective surgeries. We would just point out that while people can decide not to go out to eat, you can decide not to go to a casino, you can decide not to get on a cruise ship because you're worried about COVID. There's only so long you can have your country's high-end medical capacity be all COVID all the time. There are people with other significant medical problems. There are people with heart problems, cancer. They need knee replacements, joint replacements. There are all kinds of things that will require people to get to the hospital for care. And COVID, while terrible, is not the only medical problem we have. In the cruise line business, we're on the sidelines right now. We suspect they'll survive this, but the sailings keep getting pushed back. And even just this morning, we saw that Carnival's German subsidiary had planned to start sailing, and they're locked down again with the rest of Germany. So it looks like Asia's opening up first. There isn't a ton of capacity there right now, and we're on the sidelines waiting for maybe a better entry point, a better timing on the cruise lines.
Great, thank you. So I think, again, there are quite a number of questions in the chat. Gary, do you want to go through?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so question from Adam Blanco, two-part question. How often are the ship's hulls cleaned? What happens to the old ships? Great question, love it. So Adam, typically, and this depends on the ship, typically every 3 to 5 years, the ships are dry docked and they're pulled out of the water, they're brought into a shipyard, and they undergo some sort of renovation. Now, sometimes what we're talking about is just a cosmetic renovation. Maybe you'll replace the carpeting and repaint the ship and replace some of the art, and just cosmetic. Other times, what they've done is cut ships in half, added stuff into the middle, completely retrofitted the whole thing, almost made it like a brand new ship. And so that really depends on the age of the ship, how well it's wearing, what markets they're going to put them in. Realize that the layout of the ship depends on the market. As an example, when you take a ship out of a North American market and send it to an Asian market, they typically will increase the size of the casino, just because the Asian appetite for casino gambling is different from what we see in North America. With regard to the old ships, look at, in the end, at some point, everything is scrapped, but typically the cruise lines will sell the older ships to smaller operators. And, they basically make their way down the value chain to smaller, lower end operators. The cruise lines will typically operate a ship for 20 to 30 years, and then they'll sell it. And then depending on the condition of the ship, it'll be used as a cruise line for, another however many years, depending who owns it. And then, so here we go. Reamer actually answered the question. I love this. You'd be amazed what happens to old ships. Many end up in Africa where they're stripped and cut down. Yeah, exactly. Some of these ships are, at some point, everything gets scrapped, and at some point in between, they get basically cut in half and renovated. Comment from John Stratton here. Scrubbers related to the fuel, not cleaning the bottom of the ship. Ships have a useful life. Depends also on scrap. Yeah, John, you've got it exactly right. The scrubber is to clean the fuel. The ships are dry docked every 3 to 5 years. And the useful life for the cruise line for a Royal Caribbean or Carnival or Norwegian is 20 to 30 years, but then it'll get sold for other use. And you're right, at some point it'll be sold for scrap value. Let's see what else. Yeah, here we go. Reamer, all of his old ships, now 20 years old, still considered state of the art, moving cargo constantly, no plans to scrap them. So Reamer, great point. The only thing we'd point out is there is a difference between a cargo ship and a cruise line. A cargo ship doesn't have to be a floating resort hotel with 20 restaurants and an entertainment center and a movie theater and ice skating.
Gary, you were obviously never on one of my gas ships.
All right. You've got roller coasters and go-karts there too.
Yeah.
I will look forward to cruising on one of your cargo ships next time.
It's a great way to transit the ocean. I encourage it.
Looking forward to it. Thanks for the invitation. Adam Blanco, how is the human waste managed and treated? So obviously there is a central processing system, and Adam, it really depends on the ship and how modern it is. There is, unfortunately, I hate to report, a history of the ships dumping some gray water in the middle of the ocean. Now, is that the end of the world? Probably not. You know, a certain amount of human waste in the middle of the ocean, probably not the end of the world. There is a trend right now to cleaning it better, retaining more of it, and pumping it out. Almost less of a processing and dumping operation and more of like a septic tank pumping and port operation. I have spoken with environmental officers of the cruise lines. This is one of those areas where they are working on it. They are improving. Older practices were okay, not great. They're getting better in this area. James Carswell. Oh, this is a great question. Do the new 2020 standards also apply to merchant ships? You know what, James? Not that I'm aware of, but I'm actually not sure. I haven't looked at that. It would be an interesting question. You know, we were looking at it from the point of view of investing in the cruise lines as a result of having an interesting thesis on the change in return on capital on the cruise lines. We ended up learning a lot about their environmental practices, but we haven't looked at the merchant ships. All right, wait, hold on, Reamer, you've got Raphael is saying they do apply. Raphael, you got information on that?
Let me go out of mute. Yes, I do. It was effective in January for all merchant ships. I'm aware through that, through basically Shell and some other companies. I participated on a maritime get-together deal in Hamburg last fall. And the challenge for many of these people is that the maintenance of the ships changed dramatically. I know that we're talking about fuel and all that, but this also changing the overall cost of maintenance by changing the fuel that these engines were designed to burn. So hopefully that's helpful to you.
That's really interesting. We did not know that applied to the merchant ships. Wow. And I don't know if you guys have seen, but Reamer just sent photos from National Geographic that I'm looking at right now on what it looks like when these ships are cut apart and how they do it. They are fascinating photos. Great forward there, Reamer. Thanks.
Gary, before you go, are you also looking at river cruise ships, or are you looking at only the majors?
We've spent most of our time on the majors. There's no question, Reamer, that river cruises are growing in popularity. It's one of the fastest growing parts of the market. There aren't that many publicly traded cruise companies. I think besides the three majors, there may be one other. But at some point they get pretty small, and worth pointing out, Norwegian in the last few years, I think, has grown from somewhere in the neighborhood of like 25 to 30 ships. So, you know, at some point you're talking about operations that only have a few ships. Is there a company that you like in the space?
No, I mean, not really. So when we ran Navigator, we also ran a river ship called Saison, and it did we called it the Cruise of the Popes. So it went up into France and also into Italy, and it was a great moneymaker. I just saw that the Saison is for sale for about 4 million euros. It was the way we ran the business is we took in private investors. The European model of investing is very different than the US. So for instance, you can in Europe, for instance, people buy hotel rooms. So, hotels in Paris, the top hotels in Paris, they don't own shares in the hotels. They purchased rooms of the hotels, and then the hotel management company manages those rooms, and you get a dividend each year. And for a lot of these river ships, we were running a similar type model.
Interesting. So the thing I can tell you is that is a huge growth part of the market. We suspect that, look, everything will recover at some point. We suspect that the river cruise business in particular is going to be a little more slow in recovering. If you think about it, in Asia, it appears they have better control of the coronavirus, and that's going to work better for sailings for there. In the North American market, the big Caribbean market, which is the largest cruise market in the world, there are some other options. For instance, Royal Caribbean last year opened Perfect Day at Coco Bay. The reason that matters is it's a private island with a beach and a resort and an amusement park. But realize that because it's a private island, Royal Caribbean has complete control, and they can basically control immigration and ensure that the COVID count there remains at or around 0. Other cruise lines have private islands as well. And so those are the kinds of things we think that are going to be able to open up first. The European river cruises, where you're in close contact with a civilian population and you're stopping every day to get off the ship and mix in port, it's probably going to be a little while before that opens up.
Thank you. By the way, I mean, if you look at Disney, for instance, on the islands, they have the best record of health and cleanliness of all the ships currently in the marketplace. And the islands have been a huge boom for them. Yeah,
that's a great point. We would also applaud Norwegian as well. During the worst of the scare, Royal Caribbean had a couple of cases, nothing bad on their ships. Carnival had the disaster. I'm sure you guys heard about the ship that got quarantined for a month or two, where people were dying on the ship. And Carnival had another problem as well. Norwegian, they really managed it well, and they managed to keep the ships clean. They managed to keep everyone healthy. We think part of that is luck, part of it is a smaller fleet, and part of that is Norwegian's a really well-managed company, and they handled it well. Tony, I don't see any more questions in the chat. If you have other follow-ups, always happy to talk about this.
So thank you, Gary. Really appreciate it. Again, we're going to be here next Thursday with Paul Savoldelli, and we did not promote this because it was so sort of last minute, but we plan to do so moving forward. Encourage everyone to reach out to Gary directly with questions, anything to do with the cruise lines or his work and Deep Knowledge's work in general. And also please invite friends, anyone really that you think may be interested in our discussions moving forward every Thursday at this time.
Tony, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to be partnering with Terra. Love the work you guys are doing. Love the impact that you're making. And we're just happy to be working with you guys. Thank you.
Feeling is mutual. Thanks, Gary.